Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'm joined by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He and I are going to discuss the blues today. That is going to be our topic. I'm going to just really quickly here up front go ahead and give a shout out to the blues tradition, because it is a foundational part of almost every aspect of contemporary music. I mean, you cannot, the blue note, bending of notes on guitar, the entire tradition is huge, especially culturally. I'm not here to, Kevin and I were joking about this topic a couple weeks ago, and I was like, anything but the blues kind of thing, because I feel like sometimes especially in the guitar space or in the popular music space, the blues has a huge presence, and we're going to go into that and where it is today, or where it has been during Kevin's lifetime and my lifetime. But just right up front, I want to say, I really appreciate and actually listen to, the foundational blues artists in the guitar space. Leadbelly is somebody that I enjoy listening to this day. And there are a number of other artists that are out there that need to get their shout out. And part of why I was inspired to do this topic is I came across an article and I read it, and it was an article that interviewed famous guitar player, part of the tradition all the way back to the 30s and 40s. Began his recording career very much at the epicenter of where blues and rock and roll and all that stuff came into its own in the 50s, and that's Clarence Gatemouth Brown. And it was an interview that was done in the early 90s. He unfortunately is no longer with us. He died about 17 years ago, and but there's a lot of great YouTube footage out there of Gatemouth, and it's was really eye-opening to me. So I read the article, and he kind of like goes through a laundry list of his grievances with the blues tradition, even though he's like embedded within it. And some of the things that he said were basically, B.B. King is really not that good of a guitar player. He can kind of do that bent note thing, and then he moves around the neck, and there's not much beyond that. He also goes on to criticize the lyrical content of most blues material, saying that, it's just these same old tropes over and over again about, you're heartbroken because your woman done left you and all these kind of things. So he really gave like this startling critique of the blues tradition, and barely made mention of the type of blues that I mainly have an issue with, which is the blues that is filtered through the white tradition. There, and particularly the British, blues giants. I'm not going to name any names here, but in Britain, they all embraced the blues in the late 50s and early 60s, and so many giant guitar players that still, cast an incredibly gigantic shadow over our, contemporary guitar landscape. Basically, we're filtering the ideas of American artists and, reinterpreting them, then kind of like codifying them into this set of rhythms, a set of, licks and, ideas for how you put together a solo or a song. And it kind of has just remained entrenched ever since. We've had like 60 years of this kind of the same old. But the thing, and I'll wrap this up here in a second, but the thing that I thought was really cool about what Gatemouth had to say was that he saw that from the American side too, with the people who influenced all of those British guitar players. So I thought it was really interesting. And then I was like, well, okay, so I need to go check out some more of his stuff. And then I watched him. Gatemouth could play anything from, jazz to to blues stuff. I mean, obviously he came from that tradition, so he had a lot of that in there too. But he had Cajun music and jazz and just his own freeform style, very much based in improvisation, unusual rhythms, using even elements of classical music at times in his arrangements, and how he could manipulate his solo style. And I just found it astounding, and I can see why he would be critical of the others, because he's like, well, look at all this stuff that I do. Why aren't you guys exploring too? And I think that's what it comes down to. It's not about bashing the blues. It's about going beyond the blues. You can have it there as some sort of foundational element, but to keep regurgitating the same things, he felt, and I feel as well, was doing a disservice to the tradition. And I'll go ahead and let Kevin talk here for a second. I do have a little list where we'll hit a few other things in this topic, but I'd love to hear what Kevin's perspective is on this.
Well, that sets it up really well, Tris, and that is a fascinating article to read. And it was so straight talking and straight shooting and clear seeing that I kind of did a double take until I realized that it was published back in 1992. And then it sort of, to some extent, clicked for me because it's, along with his views particularly, back in the 80s and creeping into the 90s a little bit, there was a much more direct style of communicating and sort of saying things like it is. I remember from guitar magazines back then, and I still go back and revisit them sometimes, that the interviews, the sort of listening room where they would analyze other people's recordings and things like that, they weren't afraid to just like shoot straight because they were in the midst of an active, evolving, living sort of tradition being built. And it was just peers kind of, shooting the breeze about one another's work and how they felt about it and their place in it. And that, to me, is representative of that sort of living tradition versus that sort of stale, static tradition dichotomy that you're talking about, where some artists always remain sort of in the present moment artistically and remain themselves. If you listen to those examples that you mentioned of his work, you can really hear that the individualism in what he's doing. He's working within a tradition, within a musical context, but he always sounds like himself. He doesn't ever sound exactly like anyone else. And no matter how close to the cliche he gets, it's still being filtered through that individual perspective that is sort of questioning what to do instead of just knowing what's going to happen. That's something I appreciate about what I've heard of his work, the little sampling I've got of it, and what I've read of his words is that he's an active, engaged participant in real time creation and questioning what to do next. And I think that there was a real element of that in the transfer of that energy into British rock. And to give some credit to the British sort of rock scene, the reason I think why there were so many blues and jazz influence into and that time and space was that Americans weren't appreciating it. These were a lot of artists that had to go overseas to get work to survive. They could go to the UK or Europe and play to big crowds, nonstop, where they couldn't get anyone's attention back home. And so the transfer of that into sort of British music and European music was something that where they embraced our musical tradition in a way that we weren't really embracing it, and especially commercially. And so I think it produced a lot of really exciting dynamic changes and helped really pull together this whole concept of rock music, and that it could go in a lot of different directions. But like you said, it kind of became formulaic as well, and the audience sought out formulaic, and it kind of snowballed into something kind of stale. And we both know through our listening that some artists have always bucked that staleness, but a lot haven't. And I think it's done a disservice to the potential of the art form and to the tradition that it came from itself. So, I'm curious to see what else you have to observe about it.
Well, I think it's really interesting. You raised a nice nuanced texture there about, how the American artists, went over to Europe, and then Europe was embracing them and was excited about the music. And that's very true. And I think at the genesis of British rock, you hear some of that wildness and roughness around the edges and a lot of experimentalism. But I would argue that by, 1970, around the years of our birth, things were being codified, and it had already kind of devolved into what I want to talk about, which is like cliche, where there is a set vocabulary, and then Eric Clapton was very vocal about this. He's like, I don't play outside of what the actual traditional blues are, even though he'd kind of smoothed over all the rough edges and just came up with these, I would say a handful of like 5 riffs that he played pretty much from 1970 on until now, and it's that kind of stuff. And then that really bothers me, because a lot of guitar players then who are interested in the blues tradition, use the most popular artist as a jumping point. I would argue that there are people who listen to John Mayer or Joe Bonamassa and use that as their starting point for learning how to play blues guitar. And to me, that has been so watered down at that point and so like stock. I mean, those are all very, very stock things. They're not. There's no adventure in any of that. That it's very expected. It's what you would expect to see at your local blues festival when the guys our age, a little bit younger, a little bit older, all get up and start playing those those stock things. And it's what a lot of people like, and it's what a lot of people expect. But that cliche aspect of it is what really gets me. And that's the thing why I wanted to title this, Beyond the Blues, is that you can use it as a leaping off point. I mean, I've got blues elements in my playing. I bend notes. I do like to use, phrasing and sometimes even the scales, but in the service of something different, or just as a brief moment, moving on to something that's either more chromatic, more based in modal music, or, a little bit more of a classical background, since I'm not much of a jazz person myself. And let me just take a look at my list here real quick. And let's see what I have not hit yet. Oh, this is a big one. Not only is it overdone, I think that a lot of times with this cliched version of the blues, it's been filtered down, and now we're at this point where, you learn how to play a bunch of stock stuff, maybe never even listen to the original artists or any of that kind of thing. You're immediately placing a limitation upon yourself. Your playing is going to end up being in a pentatonic box somewhere, locked away. The chordal. If you're going to just stick to like traditional Delta blues or whatever, the chordal tradition is not very varied in many cases because of either the lack of a proper instrument. A lot of people played with slides. There's all sorts of things that, created the blues chord progression or blues type chord progressions, whereas jazz was just all over the map. A lot of blues artists did incorporate some of that jazz improvisation or richer chordal background into their music for sure over time, and sometimes just right from the beginning. However, I think that a lot of people get stuck in that 12-bar blues land with pentatonic scales, and maybe that if that's all you ever want to play, that's really okay. However, I do not want to hear it at that point. And I guess what I'm trying to get across is that I think that when you listen to somebody like Gatemouth and you go, wow, this is going everywhere and anywhere that it wants to go, and there is no limitation placed upon it. I think that as budding guitar players, or as a musician who's maybe stuck in a rut, you can still play in that tradition, but you can break it. And I guess that's what I'm calling for, is just to, there's so many instructional videos, there's so much content, there's so many things that are just rehashing these same basic tropes, and that's what bothers me. So I'll let you kind of like go ahead and react to that, kind of get us to a conclusion, I think, because I don't really
I
have
think
anything else to say. I don't think so.
Yeah, well, that says a lot, and that touches on some kind of big picture issues of, sort of what is music for? What is art for? Is it just going through the motions, or is it to create something truly individual and different and unique to the individual? And I think a lot of what we're seeing now, it's an interesting time because I think in some ways, I think the looming presence of AI is making us reevaluate sort of why we do things and what is important about doing things and what's the value of doing things. And after, the last couple decades of so many sort of fake ways to produce music and cobble music together, and the way commerce has saturated it, it's like the marketplace fueled so much invention and innovation and just great art for a time until it commodified it and over commodified it and turned it into just a repetitive product. And so now I think it's a time where we're sort of casting a fresh look on things like the concept of a tradition and the human element in it. And what does that really mean? Is it just a set of instructions to follow, or is it something to actively participate in as a thinking, breathing human who reacts to the moment and comes up with something slightly different and slightly individual? And I think that is really where the human value proposition comes in, is not just going through the motions. I mean, I'm guessing even the guys you talked about, like Bonamassa, would say, don't listen to me, listen to these guys who, and
I would hope so.
Men and women who influenced me over time, and then do your own thing out of that, because I'm a product of doing that. But whether it's blues or other types of music, there seems to be such a shallow influence with a lot of new people that hopefully they will move out of. Everybody has to start somewhere, but with the blues, I think we're seeing it as kind of almost the canary in the coal mine of what happens over the arc of a music's tradition entering the modern filter and the modern marketplace. And we can learn from it, and we can say, okay, there's still vibrant musicianship here. There are still people playing real acoustic and electric instruments and singing with their real voices, and they look all different ways and they sound all different ways. And so there's so much potential and so much good raw material here to carry a human tradition forward, as long as we don't just get stuck in the rut of the tradition. And that goes both for the artists and for the consumers. I'm a big proponent of the idea of vote with your money, and that can mean also just vote with your time, vote with your interest, vote with your clicks. What we put our fuel into as listeners contributes to whether that repetition remains or gets broken up. And so the pieces are in place. We just have to make the choices, make those, to use your word, adventurous choices. We need to seek adventure as artists by doing that individual approach to music, and then support it in others and encourage it where we see it, to kind of keep that flame going through this very, as you said, stock, very digital, very, unimaginative prevailing time in the culture.
Well, I couldn't agree more, except for one point. I am going to bash on Joe Bonamassa for a second here. He doesn't listen to the original blues artists at all. He's influenced. He's said it over and over again in any interview I've read with him. He's like, the British guys are my guys, and I'm just like, okay, well, that's why you sound the way you do. So,
yeah, and fair enough.
But yeah, I get it.
I think it's okay for him to do that thing, but it's like, why aren't there 50 more, Bonamassa level people in the marketplace who have diverse, different influences?
Yeah.
If one of them says, these particular artists are my thing, I think that's fine. But like you said, once everybody does, then it just kind of creates this, shallow reservoir of inspiration to draw from. So maybe the question is, why is he elevated to the extent that maybe others aren't and could be, and why aren't the more adventurous influences given the same prominence? Maybe that's always been a theme of
I think
popular
that's
music, but
I think that's just popular music. I think it's that comfort zone. I mean, what he does is like, Rice Krispie treats or something, and it's very approachable and it's very listenable. I think he's a tremendous guitar player. Don't get me wrong on that front, but however, there's not a iota of adventurousness there. So even with, he plays, he's famous for, all of using all the vintage gear, and sometimes, that also, so you've got the stock phrases with the adventurous gear that nobody can afford and that he's, hoarded. And it's just, that's the kind of thing that kind of makes me feel, a little bit. So
I think you just coined something there. We'll have to use it as a point of reference. Rice Krispie Treat Blues. That describes a whole lot in one little phrase.
What a terrible way to end the show, but that's how we're going to end it. You got to get beyond the blues to get beyond those Rice Krispie treats. Well, anyway, if you've watched the video to this point, we really appreciate it. I hope you hit that subscribe button. Likes and shares are also greatly appreciated. And leave something in the comments. Shed some light. I know that there are some contemporary blues artists that are very adventurous. I'm not unaware of that. But I just mainly wanted to address the whole idea of people learning just kind of like the same stuff over and over again, and not getting past it. And that's why the episode's called Beyond the Blues. All right. You take care. Hit subscribe. And we'll see you next time.